The card came back declined for the third time, and Delia Marsh watched from 2 tables away as the man in the black wool coat set it down on the counter, without a flicker of embarrassment, like a declined card was just a small weather system passing through his evening. He was tall in the way that made the diner's ceiling feel lower, broad through the shoulders, his dark hair combed back and going silver at the temples, and his eyes were a pale gray that didn't ask anyone for anything. The night manager at Rose's had already picked up the phone. "I'm calling the police, sir. This is the 2nd time this week. Somebody's tried to walk out on me." The man said nothing. He just reached into his coat again, slower this time, and Delia saw what the manager couldn't, that his wallet was gone, lifted clean off him somewhere between the door and that stool. She was 27, 3 years into night shifts at a county hospital that couldn't afford enough gloves, and she had exactly $19 folded in the pocket of her scrubs to last her until Friday. She thought about her little brother's inhaler running low on the kitchen counter. And then she stood up anyway, walked over, and laid her crumpled bills beside his coffee. "Put it on this," she told the manager, not looking at the stranger. He turned to her slowly. For a moment those pale eyes studied her worn shoes, her chapped hands, the exhaustion she wore like a second uniform. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice low and even. "I know," she answered. "I didn't do it for you." What Delia Marsh couldn't have known, what nobody in that quiet little diner could have guessed, was that the man whose meal she'd just covered with the last of her grocery money wasn't a man who forgot a kindness. He was a man who kept a ledger of them, and by the time the sun came up over Baltimore, he'd be standing outside her door. If a story like this one moves something in you tonight, do me a favor and give it a like, share it with someone who still believes small kindnesses matter, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now let's get back to that cold diner, and the debt that was about to change everything. The man did not take the crumpled bills right away, but only looked at them lying beside the cup of coffee for a long while, as though they were something he had never seen before. Then he lifted his eyes to her once more with that pale gray gaze, and when he spoke, his voice was still low and calm as before, but something in it had changed, a thin thread of attention that had not been there earlier. He asked her what her name was. Delia hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, she heard every warning. A woman working the night shift in this city learned very early. Don't give strangers your name. Don't let them know where you're going. Don't let them look at you longer than they need to. But she was too tired now, tired all the way down to her bones, and inside that exhaustion there was something that made all those warnings sound distant and meaningless. So she only said that her name was Delia Marsh. He nodded slowly, one single nod, as though he were putting that name away somewhere inside himself, where it would never be opened again. He thanked her, calling her Delia Marsh, and she heard clearly the way he pronounced both her first and last name, slowly and carefully, like a man signing an important paper. Then he stood, and when he rose to his feet, the little diner seemed to shrink around him, his shoulders nearly touching the dangling lamp above the table, and the night manager, who only moments earlier had been blustering about calling the police, suddenly stepped back half a pace without understanding why. The man lifted the collar of his wool coat, nodded to Delia one more time, then walked to the door, and the small bell on the glass door gave a soft chime as he passed through. Delia remained seated in her chair, watching his silhouette through the fogged glass, and she noticed something she should not have cared about, that outside, beneath the sickly yellow streetlight, a sleek dark car was already waiting at the curb, and its rear door opened at the exact moment he reached it, as though someone had known precisely when he would leave the diner. The man bent into the car, and before the door closed, Delia caught a glimpse of him leaning toward the driver and saying something. One short sentence, only a few words, and the car glided smoothly into the night and vanished around the corner at the end of the street. She could not hear what he had said. She could not know that what he had just told the driver was to write down the license plate of the old car parked at the edge of the lot, the faded blue car with the dent in the passenger door that she would drive home in a few minutes. Delia only sat there for a while, both hands wrapped around her own cold cup of coffee, and now, when the stranger was gone, when the impulsive act of kindness had passed and only the cold reality remained, she began to feel regret creeping into her chest like icy water seeping through the soles of her shoes. $19. She had just given away $19, all the money she had to get through until Friday, to a man wearing a wool coat more expensive than her entire month's wages, a man who clearly was not short on money, only short on his wallet. And she had done it without thinking, without calculating, just as she always acted whenever she saw someone about to be unfairly backed into a corner. She thought of the nearly empty refrigerator at home, of the last packet of instant noodles, of the electric bill stuck to the cabinet door with the red warning line printed across it, and she asked herself what she had just done. Foolish woman who never learned how to keep anything for herself. But even as she scolded herself, deep down she knew that if she could go back 5 minutes, she would still stand up exactly the same way, because there were some things a person could not simply sit still and watch, and a man being forced to stand there in humiliation over a vanished wallet was one of those things. She left her last stray coin as a tip for the weary waitress, then pulled her thin blouse around her shoulders and stepped out into the chilly night. Her old car started after 3 tries, the engine coughing and sputtering like an old man in the early morning. And Delia drove through the empty streets of Baltimore near 3 o'clock in the morning, past dark windows and streetlights casting lonely yellow pools across the wet pavement, with only one thought repeating again and again in her mind, that she had to get home, had to see whether Noah was sleeping, had to figure out how she would manage tomorrow, with what little remained in her pocket, never knowing that somewhere in this city, inside the dark car now gliding toward the harbor district, a man had carefully folded a scrap of paper with her license plate written on it and slipped it into the breast pocket of his coat, just above his heart, as though it were the beginning of something she could not yet imagine. Delia's apartment was on the ground floor of an old building on Halden Street, at the end of a hallway that always carried the faint smell of damp walls and food from families she had never met, and when she slid the key into the stubborn lock and pushed the door open, she was surprised to see yellow light spilling from the small living room, because at this hour everything should have been dark. She softly called Noah's name, and from the worn old sofa, a head of messy hair lifted, the eyes still heavy with sleep but brightening the moment they saw her. He said she was home, his voice hoarse, and Delia knew at once from the way he breathed, from the way his small chest rose and fell a little more heavily than usual, that tonight was one of his difficult nights again. Noah was 12 years old, so thin that it always made something ache inside her whenever she saw his narrow wrists sticking out of the sleeves of his too short, worn-out pajamas. He had suffered from asthma since he was very small, that illness waiting in his chest like a sleeping animal, needing only a cold night, a little dust, or a moment of worry to wake and squeeze the breath out of him. Delia told him it was very late and asked why he was not asleep yet, setting down her bag and sitting beside him, reaching out to smooth his tangled hair, and Noah shrugged in the way only children, who have had to grow up too quickly, know how to shrug. He said he had been waiting for her, and that his breathing had been a little hard, so he couldn't sleep. Delia's heart tightened, and she reached for the inhaler on the coffee table, the blue inhaler that had followed him for months, and when she shook it, the hollow, weightless sound that answered made her go cold, because it was almost empty, only enough for a few more sprays, and a new one cost nearly as much as a week's groceries for the 2 of them. But she did not let anything show on her face, because she had learned long ago that when an adult's fear slipped into the eyes of a sick child, it only made the sickness worse. So she only smiled and handed him the inhaler. She told him to take 1 puff, then they would go to sleep, because he had school tomorrow. Noah obediently lifted the inhaler to his mouth and breathed in, and Delia watched his chest ease little by little, watched his breathing gradually even out, and in that moment she saw again everything she still had to protect in this world, all of it gathered inside one small living soul, resting its head against her shoulder. The 2 of them had been all each other had left for 3 years, ever since their mother died after a long illness. Delia still did not dare think about for too long, because their mother had left behind not only an emptiness, but also a thick stack of hospital bills. Delia was still paying off month by month with her small nursing wages, while their father had left even before that, vanishing somewhere along with his bottles of liquor, and now the siblings had only each other in this ground-floor apartment. A 27-year-old woman carrying the burden of an entire family on her shoulders, and a 12-year-old boy breathing by sheer will. When Noah finally fell asleep in bed, the blanket pulled up to his chin, Delia tiptoed back out and sat at the small kitchen table beneath the only light still burning in the apartment, then took out her wallet and poured everything left inside onto the peeling wooden surface. She counted. A few small bills, several coins clinking together, and altogether a number so small it made her throat close, because she remembered that only a few hours earlier she had still had $19 more. Money that was now sitting in the cash drawer at Rose's, paid for the meal of a stranger she would never see again. She sat there for a long time, staring at the loose change, doing the calculations in her head, and every time they ended with the same result, that it was not enough for a new inhaler, not enough for the electric bill, not enough for this month's payment, not enough for anything at all. And for one moment, only one moment, when Delia lowered her head into her calloused hands and let the exhaustion of the past 3 years settle onto her shoulders, all at once, she almost cried. But she did not cry. She had never allowed herself to cry for long, because crying was a luxury for people who had someone to wipe their tears away. And she had no one but herself, and when a person was alone, she had to stay standing. So she drew in a deep breath, swept the loose bills and coins back into her wallet, turned off the light, and in the darkness of the small apartment, she told herself the same thing she told herself every night, that tomorrow she would find a way, that she always found a way, that as long as Noah was still breathing evenly in his sleep, in the next room, she still had a reason to get up the next morning, never knowing that the answer to all of this was moving toward her from a direction she could never have imagined. On the other side of the city, where massive warehouses stood silent like sleeping beasts, along the dark edge of the harbor, the dark car rolled through an iron gate that opened automatically and closed again behind it, and the man in the black wool coat stepped out beneath the cold light of the high lamps, unhurried without a single wasted movement. His name was Adriano Castellani, but for a very long time, very few people had dared call him by the name he had been given at birth, and to the people who worked under him, the people who owed him, the people who feared him, he was simply Dorian, a name spoken softly, the way people spoke of a change in the weather. At 34 years old, Dorian controlled almost everything that happened along Baltimore's eastern harbor, not through loud threats or the displays of power that small men often loved, but through something far more frightening, absolute stillness, the stillness of a man who had never needed to raise his voice, because the whole room always held its breath to hear him speak softly. When he entered the building, a tall, powerful man with a shaved head and a face as still as stone was already waiting. It was Silvio Ferraro, the man who had walked beside Dorian for 15 years, the only person in the world allowed to speak to him without choosing his words too carefully. Silvio told him they had found his wallet, his voice deep and rough as he held out the recovered leather wallet, then added that they had caught the pickpocket 3 blocks away, that the boy had not known whose pocket he had picked, and asked how Dorian wanted him handled. Dorian took the wallet, opened it, and saw that everything was still there, the cards, the bills, all of it, and he almost laughed, not because of the boy, but because of the irony of the entire evening, that he, a man who could have bought the whole street where that diner stood with one phone call, had just stood there being humiliated by a night manager because he did not have $19 in his hand, only to be rescued by a woman whose shoes were worn nearly through at the heels. Dorian told him to let the boy go, to give him a decent meal and tell him to get out of this district, because a child who picked pockets out of hunger was not their business. Silvio nodded and asked nothing more, because 15 years had taught him that, when Dorian spoke about children and hunger, there was a line that was never to be crossed. But Dorian still did not go into his office. He stood there, still holding the wallet, his pale gray eyes fixed on some empty point in the distance, and Silvio, who understood his boss better than anyone, knew that something tonight had lodged itself inside this man and refused to let go. At last, Dorian said slowly that there had been a woman who had paid for his meal when the manager was about to call the police, that she did not know who he was, that she thought he truly had no money, and she still paid, with the last bills in her pocket, because he had seen her hands counting them. Silvio frowned and asked whether he wanted him to find her. Dorian took from his breast pocket the small scrap of paper with the old car's license plate written on it and placed it on the cold metal table between them. He said her car had been parked at the edge of the lot, and he wanted to know who she was, her name, where she lived, her situation, everything. But no one was to touch her and no one was to let her know. They were only to find out. Silvio picked up the scrap of paper, looked at the numbers, then lifted his eyes to his boss with a silent question, because in 15 years he had never seen Dorian concern himself with tracking down a stranger over one meal. And Dorian, reading that unspoken question, only said softly that in their world, Silvio, people betrayed, people lied, people sold one another out for amounts far smaller than $19, that he had spent his whole life among such people, and tonight a woman who had nothing in her hands had given away the last thing she had to a stranger, expecting nothing in return. And did Silvio know how rare that was? Silvio did not answer, because the question needed no answer. Dorian went on, his voice lowering into something almost solemn, saying that debt was the most sacred thing left in this filthy world, that everyone had to repay what they owed, Silvio, including him, especially him, that people could forget a promise, forget a kindness. But he did not. He recorded everything. He looked out the large window at the far end of the room, toward the dark water and the distant glittering lights of the city on the other shore, where somewhere in that darkness there was a ground-floor apartment, and a woman who had just counted the last coins she owned. Said softly, almost to himself, that tomorrow morning he would go see her, not to frighten her, only to return what he had borrowed, and that the car should be ready at dawn. And Silvio, holding the scrap of paper with Delia Marsh's license plate in his large hand, gave one nod and quietly stepped out, leaving the most powerful man in the harbor, standing alone by the window, looking toward the sleeping city, with a new name just carved into the invisible ledger of debts he had carried with him his entire life. Delia had only slept for about 3 hours when the knock came at the door, not the urgent, frantic kind Noah made on nights when he could not breathe, but 3 slow, firm, measured knocks, the sound of someone accustomed to doors being opened for him, and she sat bolt upright on the sofa, where she had fallen asleep with a bill still clutched in her hand, her heart pounding, because in this neighborhood no one knocked at dawn bringing good news. She peered through the crack of the door and saw a tall figure filling almost the entire narrow hallway, and when she realized who it was, when she recognized the slicked-back black hair streaked with silver, and the black wool coat of the man from Rosa's the night before, her heart seemed to drop for a beat. Because how had he found this place? How did he know where she lived? And in that moment all the warnings she had pushed aside last night came rushing back at once. She opened the door a little, only a little, leaving the chain still fastened, and looked at him through the narrow gap. She asked how he had found her home, trying to keep her voice steady, though she could clearly hear the tremor in it. The man did not step closer. In fact, he even moved half a step back, so she would feel less threatened. A small gesture whose meaning she would only understand later, and he said in that low, calm voice that he was sorry for coming at this hour, that he had not meant to frighten her, that she had helped him last night, and he was not the kind of man who let something like that pass. He held out an envelope, thick, unsealed, and even through the narrow crack of the door, Delia could see that inside it was a stack of money larger than anything she had held in her hands in months. He said it was to thank her, not only for the $19, but for standing up when no one else would, and asked her to take it. Delia looked at the envelope, and for 1 second, only 1 second, she saw everything that money could buy: a new inhaler for Noah, the electric bill paid, a week without lying awake doing calculations, and the very human hunger inside her wanted to reach out and snatch it. But she did not. She unhooked the chain, opened the door a little wider, stood straight in her wrinkled pajamas, with her tangled hair and the dark circles beneath her sleepless eyes, and looked directly into the pale gray eyes of that wealthy stranger as she told him that she thanked him. But she would not accept it. The man went still, and Delia clearly saw the flicker of surprise crossing a face that rarely revealed anything. He said softly that he did not understand, that she needed it badly. He could see that, so why would she refuse? And Delia, exhausted and worn down, standing there in the darkest hour of morning, said the truest thing she had in her heart, that if she took his money, then what she had done last night would become a transaction. And it was not that. She had not helped him to get anything back. She had helped because he was being treated unfairly in that moment, and she could not stand to watch it, that was all. If she took his money now, then it would mean kindness had a price, and she would rather be poor than believe that. Then she spoke more softly, almost gently, telling him to keep his money and to get home safely. The man stood motionless for a long while, the envelope still held in his hand between them, and something was happening behind those eyes, something complicated Delia could not read, as though he were trying to find a hidden angle, a trap, a concealed motive, and slowly realizing there was none at all. At last he nodded, slowly, the same single nod from the night before, then slipped the envelope back into his coat pocket. He said he understood. He turned and walked down the hallway, but at the end of the corridor he stopped, looked back at her one last time, and in that look something had changed. It was no longer the attention of a man who wanted to repay a debt, but something deeper, almost respect mixed with curiosity, the look of a man who had just encountered something he had spent his whole life believing no longer existed. Then he disappeared from sight. Delia closed the door, leaned her back against the wood, and let out a long breath, thinking that it was over, that she would never see that strange man again. She could not know that when Dorian stepped out of the building and bent into the waiting car. He sat in silence for a long while before speaking to Silvio in the front seat, his voice utterly different, lower, more resolute, saying that she had refused an entire stack of money when she had nothing left. He looked out the window toward the dark ground floor window, where she had disappeared. He told Silvio to find out everything about her, not to repay a debt anymore, but because he needed to know how a person like that lived in a city like this. And he had a feeling, he said softly, that she was in far more trouble than she allowed anyone to see. Marlow County Public Hospital stood on the eastern edge of the city, like an aging body trying to survive one more season, with long corridors under flickering fluorescent lights, floor tiles yellowed by years of footsteps, and the distinct smell of disinfectant, mingled with something old that no one could quite name. And Delia had worked there for 3 years, long enough to know every leak in the ceiling, every door that jammed, every shortage management kept promising to fix before quietly forgetting again. That night, when she began her shift with her eyes still stinging from lack of sleep, she went looking for a box of gloves in the department supply cabinet, and found it empty again, and she stood there for a moment staring into that bare shelf, the familiar feeling of helplessness rising in her chest. She went to find Yvette Colson, the night shift head nurse, a woman in her 50s with a sharp, cold face, and eyes that always looked as if they were calculating something, and found her at the nurse's station, bent over a stack of paperwork. Delia told Yvette that the department supply cabinet was out of gloves again, both medium and small sizes, and that she had 3 patients who needed dressing changes tonight, and she couldn't do that without gloves. Yvette did not even lift her head, only kept turning the papers in front of her, and told Delia to go down to central storage and take some from there. Delia reminded her that central storage was locked after midnight, and that Yvette knew that, and that the last time she went down there, they said the department had already received its full monthly supply, even though it clearly wasn't enough. Only then did Yvette look up, and her gaze was so cold that Delia almost shivered. Yvette told her that supply inventory was the supply office's problem, not hers, that she only managed the shift, and that if Delia had complaints about allocation quotas, she could write a report to the board, but the matter was outside her authority. That phrase, outside my authority, Delia had heard it so many times that it had almost lost all meaning. A spell people in this hospital used to wash their hands of everything, to shove responsibility toward some other desk, some other person, until no one was responsible for anything anymore, and the patient simply lay there waiting. But there was something in the way Yvette hurriedly folded the file shut when Delia came near, something in the way she glanced toward the supply room door, and then looked away, that made a small corner of Delia's mind tighten, though at the time she was too tired to care. She did not argue further, because arguing with Yvette was as useless as arguing with a wall, so she quietly searched through the other backup cabinets until she found a few stray pairs of gloves someone had forgotten, then began making her rounds as she did every night. In the room at the end of the hall, bed number 7, there was Mrs. Agnes, and as usual the old woman was still awake. Mrs. Agnes was 81 years old and had been hospitalized for nearly 2 months because of a chronic lung condition, and what hurt Delia most about her was not the illness but the loneliness, because in all those 2 months Delia had not once seen anyone visit her, No children, no relatives, not a single friend, only one small old woman lying among white sheets, gazing out the nighttime window with eyes still strangely bright. When Delia stepped in, Mrs. Agnes said in her hoarse but warm voice that Delia was working the night shift again, that she worked too much, and that just looking at her, she was thin as a winter sparrow. Delia gave a quiet laugh, went to the bedside to adjust her pillow and check the IV line, and told her that she was fine, that Mrs. Agnes was the one who needed rest, and asked why she was still awake so late. And as she did every night, Delia secretly pulled from the pocket of her white coat a cookie wrapped in a napkin, something she always saved from her own meal tray, and placed it in the old woman's hand, because the food here was bland and Mrs. Agnes rarely finished her portion. The old woman took the cookie, smiled, then held Delia's hand in her own thin, age-spotted one for a long while. She softly told Delia that she was a kind person, and that in this place, kind people were rare, so she had to be careful, that she had lain here long enough to see many things. Things people thought she was too old to notice, and that there were things happening in this hospital, things about medicine, that Delia should not get involved in. Delia went still and looked at her, asking what she meant by that. But Mrs. Agnes only patted her hand gently, her eyes flickering with fatigue and something almost like fear, then turned her face toward the window. She said the time had not come yet, that Delia should take care of herself and her little brother first, but she should remember her words, that when she saw medicine suddenly disappearing from storage while the records still showed everything accounted for, she should not close her eyes like everyone else. And Delia stood there in that silent room past midnight, a chill rising along her spine that she could not yet name, never knowing that the words of a lonely old woman in bed number 7 had just opened the first door leading into a truth larger than anything she could imagine. The next afternoon, after Noah had gone to school and Delia was alone in the apartment trying to steal a few hours of sleep before the night shift, the knock came again, but this time it was not the 3 slow, solid knocks of Dorian. It was a light series of taps, almost familiar, the kind of knock made by someone who wanted you to believe he was a friend, while both of you knew he was not. And when Delia opened the door, her heart sank at the sight of Rourke Devereaux, standing there with the smile of a fox. Rourke was a thin man, dressed more carefully than necessary, with slick hair and heavy gold rings on his fingers, and he made his living from other people's desperation, lending small sums at brutal interest to families in this neighborhood when they had nowhere else to turn, then tightening his grip on them little by little until they could never get free. Delia had borrowed from him when her mother was in the final stage of illness, when hospital bills had come crashing down like floodwater, and the banks had slammed every door shut, and it was a mistake she was still paying for month after month, the debt like a bottomless hole that only grew deeper the more she tried to fill it. Rourke greeted her as beautiful Miss Marsh, stepping 1 foot over the threshold without permission so she could not close the door, his eyes flicking quickly around the small apartment with the assessing look of a man calculating what was still left to take. He said he had only dropped by to check in, that this month's payment was late again, 3 times in a row, and that she knew he had been very patient with her, didn't she? Delia stood blocking the doorway, her arms folded across her chest, trying to keep her voice calm. She told him she would pay, that she always paid, only this month her brother needed medicine, and she needed a little more time. Rourke clicked his tongue, a false little sound full of counterfeit sympathy. He said the boy, yes, that sick little boy, and that medicine was expensive. Then he tilted his head, and his smile changed into something that made Delia's skin prickle. He told her that he had a proposal that could solve both of her problems at once. He had heard she worked at Marlow County Hospital, night shift nurse, that she came and went from the medication rooms freely, and no one paid attention. He lowered his voice into a filthy kind of intimacy, saying that there were certain medications, she knew what he meant, the kind people outside would pay very high prices for. All she had to do was smuggle a little out to him from time to time, things the records would mark as shrinkage, damaged, expired anyway. No one would be harmed, and in return her debt would become noticeably lighter. Maybe in just a few months, she would be clean of it entirely. He told her to think about it, medicine for the boy, no more debt, a much easier life. For one moment the room seemed to go silent, and Delia understood at once that this was not some casual suggestion, that Rourke had calculated this in advance, that he had seen in her the perfect link, a desperate woman with keys to the rooms he wanted. And she also understood immediately, with a cold clarity, that what he was talking about were the pills that should have been in the hands of patients like Mrs. Agnes, lonely old people, children, poor families who could not afford to buy them elsewhere, and that if she did what he wanted, she would become part of the very machine that was choking the people she stayed awake all night to care for. She looked straight into Rourke's small eyes and said no, her voice even and unmoving. Rourke blinked as if he did not believe his ears, and asked what she had said. She said she had said no, that she would not take a single pill out of that hospital, that those medicines belonged to the patients, not to him, not to her, that she would rather work 3 more shifts, rather sell her car, rather do anything than take medicine from the mouths of the sick. She told him she would pay back what she owed, every penny, the same way she had borrowed it, but that other thing would never happen. The smile on Rourke's lips slowly died, and for a moment the friendly mask slipped down, revealing something cold and cruel underneath. But then he pulled the smile back into place, only this time it did not reach his eyes. He said she was a woman of principles, and that he respected that truly. He drew his foot back from the threshold and stepped into the hallway, but before turning away, he looked back, his voice frighteningly gentle as he told her that principles were a luxury, Miss Marsh, and people like her usually didn't keep them for long. He told her to think it over, that he was a patient man, but his patience, like her debt, was not without limits. Then he walked away, the sound of his gold rings tapping against the stair rail fading little by little, leaving Delia rooted to the threshold, the door still open, the chill of late afternoon spilling in, and for the first time she could feel clearly the circle closing around her, on one side a debt with no way out, on the other a conscience she would never sell, and she did not know how long she could stay standing between those 2 cliffs. Rourke's filthy proposal clung to Delia throughout that night shift like a stain that could not be washed clean, and perhaps because of it, she began looking at everything in the hospital with different eyes, sharper, more suspicious, noticing things she had once passed over in the haze of constant exhaustion. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, when she stopped by Mrs. Agnes's room to check on her, the old woman was awake as usual, but tonight something was different, her eyes unusually clear, and when Delia came to the bedside, she took her hand and pulled her down to sit on the edge of the bed, lowering her voice until it was almost a whisper. She told Delia that she had been thinking, and that she had decided she had to speak, that she did not have much time left in this world, and she did not want to carry what she had seen into the grave. Delia leaned closer, her heart beating faster, and asked what she had seen. Mrs. Agnes glanced toward the door to make sure no one was there, then began to speak. She said that from her bed, as Delia could see, she had a direct view of the hallway and the supply room door at the end of the ward, that she had been lying there for 2 months, sleepless every night, so she had seen everything. There were nights, very late, when they thought no one was awake, when people went in and out of that supply room. Not to get things for patients, she said. They carried out bags, boxes, and the next morning she would hear the young nurses complaining that medicine was short again, that gauze was gone again, while the records still showed everything fully accounted for. Medicine did not grow legs and walk away by itself, she told Delia, asking whether she understood what she meant. A chill ran along Delia's spine, because the old woman's words matched with horrifying perfection the proposal Rourke had made that afternoon. The pills that the records would mark as shrinkage, damaged, expired, those were the exact words he had used. Delia softly asked whether Mrs. Agnes had seen clearly who it was. The old woman slowly shook her head. She said her eyes were old now, and at night there was only the exit light, so she could not see the face clearly. But she knew one thing. That person had a key. That supply room was locked by a key card, and only a few higher-ranking people could open it. Whoever was taking the medicine was not some outsider sneaking in, she said. It was someone inside the house. Someone inside the house. Those 3 words settled in Delia's mind like a stone sinking to the bottom of water, because it meant this was not simply about Rourke wanting her to become his inside hand, but that there was already a network operating. Someone inside the hospital had already been moving medicine out, and Rourke merely wanted another source, another link added to a machine that had been turning for a long time. Delia thanked the old woman, told her to try to sleep, then stepped out into the hallway with her head spinning, and as if fate itself wanted to confirm her suspicion. When she passed the bend leading to the supply room, she froze and quickly pressed herself into a dark alcove in the wall. Because there, in front of the storage door, beneath the blood-red glow of the exit sign, stood Yvette Colson. The head nurse was there at an hour when she should have been at the nurse's station, and she was not alone. A man in a delivery worker's uniform stood beside her, and between them was a lidded plastic crate that Yvette was pushing toward him with a quick, secretive motion. Delia could not hear what they were saying. She only saw Yvette swipe her key card against the lock, saw the door open, saw her glance down both sides of the hallway, with the eyes of someone doing something she did not want anyone to see, and in that moment every scattered piece in Delia's mind locked together with terrifying clarity. The phrase "outside my authority" spoken too quickly. The way Yvette hurriedly closed files whenever Delia came near. The way she always brushed aside every question about missing supplies. Yvette was the insider, or at least part of it. Delia stood hidden in the darkness, holding her breath, her heart pounding so hard she feared they could hear it, and she realized she was standing before something far more dangerous than her debt to Rourke. Something that, if she became involved, even if all she did was know about it, could cost her everything. She silently backed away, one step at a time, until she was fully out of sight around the bend, and only then did she dare turn and walk quickly back toward her ward, her breath coming fast, with only one thought ringing in her mind, that she had just seen something she should never have seen, that this network was larger, deeper, and more firmly rooted than she had ever imagined, and that now, whether she wanted it or not, she had become someone who knew too much. For several nights after that, Delia could not push the image of Yvette standing in front of the storage room door out of her mind, and though every survival instinct inside her screamed for her to forget it, to lower her head and do her work, to take care of Noah and not get involved in something that could swallow both of them whole, there was still something else inside her, the same thing that had made her stand up at Rose's that night, that would not allow her to turn away. So one night, when the hospital had gone quiet, she went again to Mrs. Agnes's bedside, and this time Delia was the one who began the conversation, whispering to the old woman what she had seen outside the supply room. Mrs. Agnes listened, her wrinkled face growing heavier with every passing moment. Then she released a long sigh, as though laying down the burden of an entire lifetime. The old woman softly told her that she had never told Delia this before, but she had not always been only a patient here, that she had once worked at Marlow Hospital for nearly 30 years, in the pharmacy department, until she retired almost 10 years ago, and that she knew this place from the inside out, and she told Delia that the missing medicine here was not something new. It had been going on for a very long time, even back when she still worked here. In those days, there had been a network like this too, moving medication out and selling it elsewhere, targeting expensive medicines, treatments for the seriously ill, the very things poor patients needed most and somehow always lacked. Delia felt something strange rising in her chest, a vague instinct she could not yet name, and she asked the old woman to go on. Mrs. Agnes closed her eyes for a moment, as if searching through her memory. She remembered a period perhaps 3 or 4 years earlier, just before she left completely because of her health, when that network had been very active. Certain medications for patients in the final stages of lung disease, good medications, expensive medications, would arrive and then disappear, and the patients would be switched to cheaper, weaker alternatives without their families ever knowing. She had seen several cases pass away when they might have lived longer if they had received the proper medicine the hospital should have had available. And when Mrs. Agnes said that, something in Delia's mind went cold, because 3 or 4 years earlier was also the time when her mother had been lying here, in this very Marlow hospital, in the pulmonary ward, fighting the illness that had taken her away, and Delia remembered those final days with painful clarity, remembered the way the doctors kept changing her mother's medication, again and again, remembered the way they said the best medicine was temporarily unavailable, that they had to wait for the next shipment, remembered the way her mother grew weaker and weaker, while the promises about the medicine kept moving farther ahead until there was no time left to wait. Back then, Delia had been too young, too grieving, too trusting of people in white coats to suspect anything. She had accepted that explanation as a fact of fate, that the medicine was not available, that the hospital was poor, that there was no one to blame. But now, sitting beside Mrs. Agnes's bed past midnight, with everything she had just heard, a terrible possibility opened before her like an abyss. That perhaps her mother's medicine had never truly been unavailable. That perhaps it had been there, in storage. Only someone had taken it away and sold it outside. That perhaps her mother did not have to die, at least not so soon and not so painfully, if the pills that should have belonged to her had not been stolen by the greed of people who valued human lives less than money. Delia sat motionless, her hands clenched together until her knuckles turned white, and she felt an emotion she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time rising inside her. Not sorrow, but anger, deep and cold. Anger for her mother, anger for Mrs. Agnes, anger for every patient who had lain in this place and been robbed of the chance to live simply because they were poor and had no one to protect them. Her voice trembled as she whispered to Mrs. Agnes that her mother had died in this hospital's pulmonary ward 3 years ago. Mrs. Agnes opened her eyes and looked at her, and in those old eyes rose an endless sorrow. She reached out with her thin, trembling hand and took Delia's hand in hers, unable to say anything because some truths were too large to be comforted with words. And in that moment, in the stillness of the hospital room, where there was only the steady sound of the breathing machine, something inside Delia changed forever. This fight was no longer only about her debt, no longer only about some vague idea of justice. Now it belonged to her. It bore her mother's name, and she knew, with a certainty that frightened even her, that she could not turn her back and walk away anymore. 3 days later, when Delia had just finished her shift and stepped into the hospital parking lot under the cold gray light of early morning, she saw Rourke Devereaux waiting beside her old car, and the instant she saw him, she knew this time was completely different from before, because his face no longer carried the smile of a fox pretending to be friendly, but a cold, impatient look, the face of a man whose patience had run out and who no longer cared to hide it. He said her name without any polite greeting, then told her he had given her time to think and had come now to hear her answer. Delia tightened her grip on the strap of her bag, trying to keep her voice from shaking, and told him that her answer was still the same as before, that she would repay her debt according to the agreement, but she would not touch the hospital's medicine, never. Rourke nodded slowly, as though he had expected that answer and had already prepared for it. He told her he had hoped she would be wiser, but if she wanted to play the woman of principle, then he had his own ways. He took a phone from inside his coat, swiped it a few times, then held the screen out toward her, and Delia saw photographs on it, photographs of hospital supply withdrawal forms, with her name, with her signature, forms she remembered signing when she collected gloves, gauze, and small routine supplies for the ward. But now beside them were added notes about expensive medications, missing quantities, all arranged so cleverly that it looked as if Delia herself had been the one moving them out. Rourke said it looked beautiful, his voice sweet as honey and cold as ice, then told her that he had friends everywhere, including inside her hospital. All he had to do was send these things to the board, to the police, and what did she think would happen? A poor nurse drowning in debt, with a clear motive and her signature on the paperwork. Who would people believe, her or this evidence? She would lose her job immediately. No, worse than that, she would be prosecuted. And how could a woman prosecuted for theft, a woman in prison, take care of a sick little brother? They would take him away, Miss Marsh. Put him in a home. She would lose everything. Each of his words was like a blade thrust into the softest place inside Delia, and she felt the ground beneath her feet sinking away, because he had found the fatal point, not her life, not her freedom, but Noah, the frail little brother who breathed by sheer will, the only thing in the world she would trade everything to protect. She told him he could not do that, but even she could hear the desperation in her voice. Those papers were fake, she said. She could prove it. Rourke gave a quiet laugh and put the phone away. Prove it, he asked. With what? To whom? Did she have money to hire a lawyer? Did she have anyone standing on her side? She had nothing, Miss Marsh, and that was the beautiful part. She was completely alone. He gave her exactly 1 week. 1 week to start working for him, or those pieces of evidence would reach the people who needed to see them. He told her to go home and think it over, to hold her little brother and think very carefully. Then he turned and walked leisurely across the empty parking lot, leaving Delia rooted beside her car, her hands shaking violently, and she stood there long after he had disappeared, unable to move, until she realized she was crying, silent tears rolling down her face that she did not bother to wipe away. She drove home through the morning mist, and when she reached the apartment, she stood at the doorway of Noah's room and watched him still sleeping deeply, his face peaceful in sleep, his small chest rising and falling evenly, and she had to grip the doorframe tightly to keep from breaking down aloud. That night, after Noah had gone to bed, Delia sat alone at the kitchen table beneath the dull yellow light, and for the first time in 3 years of forcing herself to stay standing, she felt as if she was truly about to collapse. She thought of every road and saw every one of them blocked. If she obeyed Rourke, she would betray everything she believed in, betray even the memory of her mother, become exactly the kind of person who had killed her, and if she refused, she would lose her job, her freedom, and Noah. She lowered her head into her hands and finally let the tears she had held back for years break open, crying for her mother, crying for her brother, crying for herself, a woman who had given away too much and had never once been repaid by life. And in the lonely darkness of that small kitchen, she whispered to someone, to herself, to the stars she no longer believed in, that she did not know what to do anymore, that she was exhausted, that this time she truly could not see a way out. She had no idea that in those very darkest hours, on the other side of the city, a man in a black wool coat was reading a file about her life, and everything he read was making his pale gray eyes grow darker by the moment. The very next evening, just after Delia had taken Noah to stay with the kind neighbor, so she could get ready for her night shift, the familiar dark car appeared again, pulling quietly to the curb in front of the building, and the man in the black wool coat stepped out, this time carrying no envelope, no words of thanks, but gravity that made Delia stop short in the walkway. Dorian said her name, Miss Marsh, then told her he needed to speak with her, only for a few minutes, that it was important, and he believed it concerned her safety. Delia folded her arms, wary, because after everything that was happening, trust was a luxury she no longer dared give anyone. She asked why he had come looking for her again, saying she had thought they were finished with each other. Dorian looked at her for a moment, then said, directly and without evasion, something she would later be grateful for, that she had the right to know who he was before hearing what he was about to say. His name was Adriano Castellani. In the Eastern Harbor district of this city, and in many other places too, people called him Dorian. He was not an ordinary businessman, Miss Marsh, and he would not insult her intelligence by pretending otherwise. He ran operations that the law did not always approve of. Many people in this city feared him, and they had reason to fear him. Delia felt her breath catch, because although she had dimly sensed the dark power radiating from this man from the very first night, hearing him say it himself still sent a chill down her spine, and her first instinct was to step back, to run inside and lock the door. But there was something in the way he stood there, keeping his distance, not threatening her, his hands resting where she could see them, that made her stay. She asked, her voice both frightened and defiant, what a man like him wanted from a poor nurse like her. Dorian said that after she refused to take his money, he had someone look into her. He knew that was an intrusion, and he would not apologize for it, but he wanted her to understand why. In his life, he had met every kind of person, and nearly all of them wanted something. But she had wanted nothing. He had needed to understand a person like that, and when his people looked into her, they found things he believed she was carrying alone. He stepped one pace closer, his voice lowering. He said he knew about Rourke Devereaux, he knew about her debt, and he knew what Rourke was trying to force her to do. Delia felt her heart pounding and asked how he knew about that. Dorian answered that Devereaux was operating on territory he controlled, and he was doing something that even in Dorian's world was considered among the filthiest things of all. Moving medicine out of hospitals, stealing medicine from the sick, from the elderly, from children, and selling it for profit. Dorian's gray eyes darkened, and for the first time Delia saw a real emotion flash through them, not cold calculation, but a deep and personal anger. He told her he had his own principles, Miss Marsh. People could call him a bad man, and perhaps they were right. But there were lines he never crossed and never allowed anyone to cross on his ground. Hospitals, medicine, children, those were untouchable. Devereaux had broken that line, and he had chosen the wrong person to threaten. Delia stood there with a storm tearing through her mind, because one part of her wanted to believe this man, wanted to believe that at last someone was standing on her side after so many years of fighting alone. but another part screamed a warning that he was a crime boss, that accepting help from a man like him was no different from stepping into another trap, that men like him never gave anything for free. So she said slowly that he wanted to help her, but what would he want in return? He had just said everyone wanted something, so what did he want from her? That question made Dorian fall silent for a moment, and then the corner of his mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, but something fragile and almost sad. He said that was exactly the difference, Miss Marsh. He wanted nothing from her. She had given him something money could not buy on a night when she had nothing left to give. Now it was his turn. She did not have to become his person, did not have to owe him, did not have to do anything at all. He only needed her to let him handle Devereaux. He looked straight into her eyes, but he would not do it if she said no. In all the things he did, this was the one he would let her decide for herself. She had already been exhausted enough by other people forcing her. And Delia stood there beneath the yellow streetlight, with the man who was suffocating her life on one side, and this dangerous man holding out his hand on the other. And for the first time in many days, she felt a fragile beam of light pierce through the darkness. Though she still did not know whether she dared to take that hand, Delia still had not answered. And perhaps it was that very hesitation that made Dorian understand he needed to give her more than empty promises. So he did something Silvio, sitting in the car, would later admit he had never seen his boss do with anyone. He slowly sat down on the concrete step in front of the old building, lowering himself to her level, setting aside that frightening air of authority, to become only a man talking beneath the nightlight. He said she was wondering how she could possibly trust a man like him, and she should be wondering that. But to let him tell her who he was, not the shell this city saw, but the principles that governed him. In his world, Miss Marsh, everything had rules even if outsiders could not see them. And his first rule, the rule he would rather die than break, was never to make money from the things that kept people alive. Not medicine, not hospitals, and absolutely never touch a child. He stopped, his eyes gazing distantly into the darkness at the end of the street, as though looking toward some place very far in the past. He said there were men in his business who would do anything for money, who sold things that destroyed people, who preyed on the weakest. He was not that kind, and he had spilled blood to keep it that way. Devereaux was different. He looked at a sick child and saw only leverage to force the child's mother, no, the child's sister, to do what he wanted. He looked at medicine meant for patients and saw only money. To Dorian, a man like that did not deserve to be called human. Delia listened, and though every reasonable part of her still reminded her to be cautious, she could not deny that there was a naked honesty in his voice, something that could not be performed. She hesitated and said that he still was, that he still did illegal things, that he was still the kind of man people like her were taught to stay away from. Dorian answered that she was right, without avoiding it at all. He had not come here to convince her that he was a good man. He was not. He had only come to say that in this matter, the enemy of her enemy was standing before her, and he happened to have the ability to do what the police, the hospital, and the very system that had abandoned her for years had failed to do. Then he went on, and his voice softened into something almost gentle, saying there was one thing he needed her to understand clearly, and it did not depend on whether she agreed to let him handle Devereaux or not. Her brother, the boy with asthma, he knew the child was short on medicine. Starting tomorrow, the boy would have all the medicine he needed, the best kind, delivered straight to him, and he would never go without it again, not as a trade. Not to force her into owing him, but because no child deserved to struggle for breath, only because his sister could not afford it. And because Dorian had more than enough power to make sure it never happened again. If she told him to leave right now and never wanted to see him again, the boy's medicine would still come. That was his word. Delia felt her throat tighten, and she had to turn her face away for a moment so he would not see the tears gathering in her eyes, because in the past 3 years, no one, not one relative, not one coworker, not one agency, had ever held out a hand to her without attaching a condition, a judgment, or the words outside my authority. And now the first person to do it was a crime boss sitting on the front steps of her building at midnight, and that contradiction made her want to laugh and cry at the same time. She asked softly, her voice trembling, why he cared so much about the boy when he had never even met him. Dorian was silent for a long while, and in that moment Delia saw some shadow pass across his face, an old pain buried very deep. But then he only stood, brushed lightly at the leg of his pants, and said that one day he would tell her, but not today. He looked at her, and in those gray eyes was a patience she had not expected. She did not have to decide anything tonight about Devereaux. She could think. But the boy's medicine did not need her to think. That had already been decided. Then he nodded to her, that familiar single nod, turned and walked back toward the car, leaving Delia standing alone on the steps with a strange feeling beginning to take root in her hardened chest. Something she had forgotten long ago, fragile and frightening, a thread of hope, and for the first time she wondered, cautiously and tremblingly, whether perhaps she did not have to fight alone anymore. While Delia returned to her night shifts, trying to act normal under Yvette's scrutinizing gaze, and beneath the threatening shadow of the one-week deadline Rourke had given her, across the city, in the large room overlooking the harbor, a quiet and precise machine had begun to move, because Dorian was not the kind of man who acted on impulse or with his fists, but with information, and he knew that the way to bring down someone like Devereaux was not violence, but the truth recorded so completely that it could not be denied. Dorian stood before a large board where his people had begun pinning slips of paper, photographs, and threads connecting names together, and told Silvio to tell him about the man. Silvio, notebook in hand, began laying it out in an even voice. Rourke Devereaux had been loan sharking across the East Side for 7 or 8 years, targeting people who could not borrow from banks, immigrants, the sick, families with someone dying. His interest rates were enough to drown anyone, but the lending was only the surface. Around 3 years ago, he started getting involved in the medicine network, and that was where he was truly making money. Dorian looked at the board, his gray eyes sweeping over each name, and said Devereaux could not be taking medicine out of the hospital himself, that he needed someone inside. Silvio nodded and said exactly, then pointed to one name. They had been following his money trail in meetings for 2 weeks now. He had at least one contact inside Marlow Hospital, someone with access to the pharmacy storage room. They had not confirmed the identity yet, but one name had appeared several times, a night shift head nurse. Dorian stopped there, and in his mind rose the image of Delia, speaking of the woman who always said outside my authority, the woman who always brushed aside every question about missing medication. He quietly said Yvette Colson. Silvio answered that it was possible, but there was something strange. His people had watched her for several nights, and she showed no signs of someone getting rich. Same old rented apartment, same old car, no unusual spending. If she was moving medicine for money, then where was the money? Dorian frowned, taking in that detail as a puzzle piece that did not fit, a question that needed an answer, because a lifetime of experience had taught him that the details that did not fit always hid an important truth inside them. He told Silvio to keep watching her, not to touch her, only to observe. He wanted to know why she was doing this, because that would tell him how to deal with her. In the days that followed, Dorian's network quietly spread across the city. Invisible people no one noticed began gathering each fragment of truth. An accountant who had once worked for Devereaux was persuaded to speak about unexplained sums of money. A delivery driver was caught, and given a simple choice between cooperation and consequences. Security footage from cameras near the hospital was copied, showing a familiar small truck parked at the rear entrance during the deepest hours of night. And little by little, the board in Dorian's room filled up, the tangled threads drawing the portrait of an entire network, from the pills disappearing from storage, through the hands of someone inside the hospital, to Devereaux's warehouse, and then into the black market. One night, as the two men stood before the board, now almost complete, Silvio remarked that Devereaux was careful. He left very few direct traces. His loan records were well hidden, and the medicine transactions passed through many layers of intermediaries. If they wanted enough evidence to destroy him completely, not just frighten him but finish him legally, they needed his original ledger, the one that recorded everything, and they needed testimony from the person inside the hospital. Dorian nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the board. Then those were the two things they had to get, the ledger and the person inside. He folded his arms, and in the stillness of the room, with only the soft slap of water against the harbor outside, he said, almost to himself, that he did not want to merely scare Devereaux and have him spring up somewhere else, doing the same thing to another desperate woman. He wanted him gone from these people's lives forever, cleanly, legally, irreversibly. He wanted, when this was over, no child in this city to ever lack medicine because of that man's greed again. Silvio looked at his boss, the man he had followed for 15 years, and realized that this time something was different. That this was no longer only a matter of cleaning up his territory or repaying a debt of gratitude, but had become something much deeper to Dorian, though even Silvio did not yet fully understand why. So he only nodded, closed his notebook, and said that he would handle the ledger. But as for the person inside, he thought Dorian would need the nurse's help. The question Silvio had left behind, where Yvette's money was, kept haunting Dorian, and he passed it on to Delia the next time they met, asking her to try to approach the head nurse, not to accuse her, but to understand, because he had a feeling that Yvette's story was more complicated than the cold exterior she showed the world, and Delia, who had spent her whole life seeing the real human being behind layers of weariness, was the right person to do it. The opportunity came on a rainy night, when the shift had quieted, and Delia found Yvette standing alone in the emergency stairwell, where she thought no one could see her, and in the dim light Delia saw something she had never seen in that iron-hard woman before. Yvette was crying, silently, her shoulders trembling, a crumpled piece of paper clenched in her hand. Delia's first instinct was to turn away, but then she thought of her mother, of Mrs. Agnes, of all the stolen medicine, and she stepped forward, standing quietly beside the woman who had treated her coldly so many times, then softly asked if she was all right. Yvette startled, hurriedly wiping her face, trying to pull the familiar mask back into place. She said it was nothing and told Marsh to go back to the ward. But her voice had broken, and Delia did not leave. Delia said softly that she knew what Yvette was doing with the medication storage room, and she saw Yvette go rigid, her face turning pale. Delia said she had seen her the other night, and she knew Yvette was being forced, wasn't she? Because a person doing this for greed did not look the way Yvette looked now. For a long moment, Yvette only stood there, torn between denial and collapse, and then, like a dam that had held back too much water for too long, she broke. She whispered in a voice full of pain that Delia could not understand. That Delia thought she was doing this for money, but she had never taken a penny for herself. Her daughter, her Hannah, had fallen into debt with that very Devereaux, back when she was still foolish and young. Then she disappeared, ran away, leaving the debt behind and a small child, Yvette's grandson. Devereaux came to Yvette. He said that if she did not help him take the medicine, he would dump all of Hannah's debt onto her. He would take the house, and worse, he threatened to make her lose custody of the boy, her grandson, the only person she had left in this world. She began sobbing and said she hated herself every night, Marsh. That every time she opened that storage room door, she knew she was stealing medicine from people like the old woman in bed number 7, the one Delia often cared for. But what was she supposed to do? Should she leave the boy for Devereaux to swallow whole? Delia stood motionless, and inside her, something both broke open and knit itself together, because she realized Yvette was not the evil person she had believed her to be, but another victim of the same devil, strangled by the same noose, threatened through the very child she loved most, exactly the way Rourke was using Noah to threaten Delia. And in that moment of understanding, Delia knew what she had to do. She took Yvette's hand, and in a voice both gentle and firm, she told her to listen, that she and Delia were being forced by the same man in the same way. He was using Yvette's grandson, and he was using Delia's little brother. As long as he could hold them by fear, he would never let go. But there was someone who could end this, end it completely, make sure he could never hurt anyone again. That person only needed evidence, and Yvette was the one who could provide it. The documents, the deliveries, everything he had forced her to do, all of it. Yvette shook her head, trembling with fear. She said that if she did this and failed, he would kill her, he would destroy her grandson. Delia said it would not fail, and even she was surprised by the certainty in her own voice, a certainty born from the new and fragile trust she had placed in the man in the black coat. This time they were not alone, Yvette. For the first time, they were not alone. The man helping her was strong enough to protect both Yvette and her grandson. Delia promised her that. But Yvette had to choose. She could keep being afraid and remain his slave for the rest of her life, or she could stand on the right side, right now, and take her life back. Yvette looked at her for a long time, her red eyes shining with tears, and in those eyes Delia saw the battle between the fear that had bound the woman for so many years in something else, more fragile but stronger. The longing to do the right thing just once, to look in the mirror without hating herself. And finally, very slowly, the head nurse nodded, one small nod that held within it a decision that would change everything. Then she whispered, her voice still trembling, but now carrying a thread of something steadier, that she would help. She had kept everything, Marsh. Every delivery slip, every message from him. She had kept them in case this day ever came. Delia only had to tell her who to give them to. But men like Rourke Devereaux did not survive and grow powerful in the underworld because of luck, but because of an animal instinct, an ability to smell danger before it fully took shape, and in those days he began to feel that something was wrong. One of his delivery drivers suddenly disappeared, without explanation. An old accountant whose silence he thought he had bought abruptly stopped answering his calls. There were strange cars he glimpsed in places where he did not expect to see them, parked a little too long, then gone. And worst of all, he heard whispers from a contact that someone was asking questions about him. Not the police, but someone else, someone from the harbor, someone whose name even the most reckless men lowered their voices to mention. Rourke was a fool. He put the scattered pieces together, and though he did not yet know exactly what was happening, he smelled betrayal, and in his mind every road led back to one name, the stubborn nurse who had dared to say no to him, the only woman lately who had slipped out from under his control. He muttered in the back room of the pool hall he used as a den that the girl, that nurse, knew something, or she had told someone. He had given her 1 week, there were still 2 days left, and suddenly everything was starting to fall apart. How could that be a coincidence? His trusted subordinate shrugged and asked whether he wanted her dealt with right away, forced to stay quiet or disappear. Rourke tapped his gold rings against the tabletop, his small eyes narrowing with calculation. Not yet. He needed to know who she had spoken to, but he wanted to remind her who she was playing with. He wanted her so frightened she would not dare breathe too loudly. He told the man to learn her habits, where she went, what she did, and the sick little brother too. At that very moment, across the city, as if an invisible thread connected decent people to one another, Dorian was sitting across from Delia in a small, quiet coffee shop he had chosen because it was discreet, and he spoke to her in a serious voice that made her heart sink. He told her Devereaux had begun to suspect. His people reported that the man was having someone ask around about her. That meant they were very close, and an animal was most dangerous when cornered. He needed her to listen to him very carefully. He looked straight into her eyes and said he needed her to take her brother somewhere safe, immediately, and keep him there until this was over. Delia felt a cold fear rise inside her, and asked if he thought Rourke would touch Noah. Dorian said he did not think Devereaux would dare harm a child, that even he knew what crossing that line would bring down on him, but he did not gamble a child's safety on an if. He never took risks with a child. He asked whether she had anyone trustworthy away from the city, someone Devereaux did not know about. Delia slowly nodded, thinking of her mother's cousin who lived in a small town almost 2 hours away, a gentlewoman Noah loved dearly. Someone neither Rourke nor anyone in this neighborhood even knew existed. She said she had an aunt, far away, and Noah liked staying there. Dorian said good. His people would take both of them there tonight, discreetly and safely. The boy would think it was a little trip. He did not need to know anything about what was happening, and he should not know. That night, Delia packed a small bag for Noah, and when the boy grew excited about getting a few days off school to visit their aunt in the country, chattering about whether he could bring his colored pencils and sketchbook, Delia had to use every bit of strength she had to keep a smile on her face, holding him tightly and kissing his forehead, hiding all the fear churning inside her. She told him to be good and draw lots of beautiful pictures for her, her voice catching, and promised she would come get him soon. Noah wrapped his arms around her neck, innocent and unaware, telling her to remember to eat properly and not skip meals like she always did. And when the discreet car carrying her brother rolled into the night, taking him to safety far beyond the reach of danger, Delia stood watching it leave with burning eyes. One part of her heart relieved because she knew he was beyond the devil's grasp, the other part tightening because she understood that sending Noah away meant the final battle was drawing near, and this time she would have to stand on the front line. When the 1-week deadline ended, Rourke came looking for Delia one evening. no longer waiting for her in the hospital parking lot, but coming straight to her apartment, and this time he did not come alone. Two broad-shouldered, heavily built men lingered behind him near the end of the hallway, a silent reminder of what he could do. But what Rourke did not know, what he could not possibly have expected, was that the empty apartment behind Delia no longer held the sick little brother he intended to use as a pawn, and that the woman standing before him tonight was entirely different from the trembling woman he had met in the parking lot a few days earlier, because for the first time in 3 years, Delia was no longer fighting alone. Rourke spoke her name, Miss Marsh, his voice stripped of all its false sweetness now, leaving only naked threat, and said that the week was over. He had heard a few interesting things about her. It seemed she had been talking to people she should not have talked to, and he asked whether she wanted to explain herself before he lost all patience. Delia stood in the doorway, arms no longer folded defensively across her chest but resting calmly at her sides, her chin lifted. When she looked straight into his small eyes, she realized something that surprised even herself. She was no longer afraid of him. She told him she had nothing to explain to him, Mr. Devereux, and that she would tell him what she should have said from the very beginning. No, not today, not tomorrow, not ever. She would not move a single pill for him. She would not become his accomplice in stealing the lives of sick people. He could take his forged papers anywhere he wanted. He could do the worst thing he could think of, but he would never buy her. Rourke blinked, and for one instant true astonishment showed on his face, because he was used to breaking people, used to watching them lower their heads and submit beneath fear. And yet the thin woman standing upright before him tonight, with no money, no power, nothing at all, was refusing him with a dignity he had never possessed in his life. He asked through clenched teeth whether she knew what she was doing, stepping one pace closer, and the two men behind him moved forward as well. He asked who she thought she was to dare say no to him, then asked where her sick little brother was, saying perhaps he should go find him and remind her what she still had to lose. The instant he spoke that threat against Noah, a low, cold voice sounded from the far end of the hallway, a voice that made all 3 men jerk around in shock. The voice said he would not say that sentence again if he were Rourke. Silvio stepped out of the darkness, his massive body taking up almost the entire width of the hallway, and behind him were 2 other men, silent and solid as walls. Rourke, who had believed he held the upper hand, suddenly realized the board had turned against him, and in a surge of panic mixed with rage, he signaled for his 2 men to rush forward. The clash happened swiftly and decisively in the cramped space of the hallway. Rourke's men were vicious, but they were no match for men trained by Silvio, and within moments they had been locked down and forced to the floor, neutralized cleanly without any unnecessary brutality, because Dorian's men had been ordered to control, not destroy. Delia stepped back into the doorway, her heart pounding, and within only a few seconds everything was over. Rourke's 2 men held firmly and unable to move, while Rourke himself stood rooted in place, his face pale, as he realized he had been completely placed at a disadvantage. He stammered, asking who they were, whether they knew who they were getting involved with. And just then, from the end of the hallway, a tall figure in a black wool coat stepped out of the darkness, each step slow, calm, and measured, and when the light fell across his face, Delia saw Rourke Devereux, the man who had spread fear across the east side for years, turn white and take 1 step back, because even a man like him knew the name attached to the man before him, and knew that the moment Dorian Castellani appeared in person was the moment every calculation he had made collapsed. Delia watched Dorian approach, and in the frightening stillness radiating from him, she understood that tonight, at last, the scales had tipped toward the powerless, and that the devil who had tormented her life was about to face something he had never encountered before. Dorian did not raise his voice, did not threaten, did not even quicken his steps. He only came to stand before Rourke with the same calm he had carried through his whole life, and that calm in a narrow hallway with 2 henchmen pinned down and a woman standing close to the doorframe was more frightening than any rage could have been. He said that Rourke had asked whether he knew who he was getting involved with. And that question, Mr. Devereux, was one he should have asked himself a long time ago. Rourke had been operating on Dorian's ground for 3 years, charging brutal interest to people who had nowhere left to turn. That was something Dorian could have closed his eyes to, because this world was cruel by nature. But Rourke had gone farther than that. He had moved medicine out of hospitals. He had stolen pills that should have belonged to the elderly, the sick and children, just to fill his own pockets. And worst of all, he had looked at a woman who had nothing but her 2 hands and a sick little brother, then decided to use that child as leverage to break her. He tilted his head, and in his gray eyes there was a contempt so cold it cut to the bone. He said that was where he and Devereaux were different. Rourke thought power was the ability to choke the weakest person in the room. But that was not strength. That was cowardice wearing the mask of strength. A truly strong man never choked the weakest person. Any coward could do that. A truly strong man was the one who stood between the weak and beasts like him. Rourke, driven against the wall, tried to scrape together the last of his aggression. He said Dorian did not understand that the nurse owed him money, that she had an obligation to pay, that he was only demanding what belonged to him. Dorian repeated calmly that she owed him money, and then said he would tell him where that debt stood now. It had been paid, cleanly. From that moment on, Delia Marsh did not owe him a single cent. As for the other things, the forged papers he had used to threaten her, the ledgers recording his filthy business, Dorian was afraid they were about to change hands. And at that very moment, as though every piece had been arranged for this instant, footsteps sounded at the end of the hallway, and Yvette Coulson stepped out of the elevator, clutching a thick file case to her chest, her face pale but her eyes burning with a determination Delia had never seen in her before. Yvette walked straight past Rourke, who was staring at her with his mouth open as though he could not believe it, and placed the case in Dorian's hands. She said everything was in there, her voice trembling but firm. Every delivery slip from the past years, every message he had sent forcing her to take the medicine, dates, times, quantities, the names of the men who received his shipments. She had kept it all, every piece, in case the day ever came when she was brave enough to end this. Then she turned to look directly at Rourke, the man who had controlled her through her own grandson, and for the first time in years, her voice no longer trembled with fear. She told him he had nothing left to threaten her with. Devereaux, that she would rather lose everything than continue being his puppet for one more day. Rourke's face turned as white as paper, and Delia witnessed the moment the entire castle of fear he had built over so many years collapsed right before his eyes. Because now the only power he had ever truly possessed, the ability to make others afraid, had dissolved into smoke. Dorian took the file case, opened it and glanced through it, then closed it again, and he looked at Rourke with something almost like pity. He said Rourke could see it now, that this was what men like him never understood. Fear only bound people as long as they were alone. The moment they realized they were no longer alone, his fear had no value left. Miss Marsh was no longer alone. Mrs. Coulson was no longer alone. And he, Dorian, paused, his voice lowering into a deathly stillness. He admitted he had never been as strong as he believed. He was only a man who specialized in finding people too exhausted to fight back. But this time, he had chosen the wrong person. Rourke opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. And in the silence that filled that shabby hallway, he finally understood that he had lost, not to fists or bullets, but to something he had never possessed and would never understand. The dignity of the people he had thought had already been crushed beneath his heel, after Silvio's men had escorted the 2 henchmen and the completely broken Rourke Devereaux out of the building, leaving him to await the fate that the evidence in Yvette's file case would decide. The hallway fell quiet again, and Delia found herself standing there, trembling from the aftershock of everything that had just happened, facing the man who had changed everything. Dorian told Yvette to go home and rest, promising that she and her grandson would be kept safe, and when only the 2 of them remained in the empty hallway, Delia finally asked the question that had weighed on her heart for so many days. She asked why he had done all of this. A $19 meal. He could have paid her back 100 times over and forgotten it, but instead he had investigated an entire network, confronted a dangerous man, and protected both her and Yvette. No one did that much just because of one meal. So what was it really about, Dorian? The man was silent for a long time, his eyes leaving her and settling somewhere on the stained wall. And Delia saw the old darkness she had glimpsed once before return to his face, this time heavier, more real. At last he said she was right, his voice lower now. Nothing like the powerful calm from before, only the voice of a human being. It was not because of $19. It had never been because of $19. He leaned back against the wall and began to speak, slowly, as though opening a door that had been locked for a very long time. He told her he had not always been the man she saw now. He had grown up in the southern slums of this city, the son of a single mother who worked 3 jobs at once, and a father whose face he had never known. They were poor in the way she understood well, the kind of poor that meant hunger, the kind that meant winter without a proper coat. When he was 9 years old, he fell gravely ill, a case of pneumonia that turned dangerous, a fever so high he became delirious. His mother had no money, no insurance, nothing at all. She carried him into the emergency room of a public hospital, and by all the usual rules of this system, he should have been pushed back out, a poor child with no papers and no ability to pay. His voice trembled slightly as he said that there had been a night nurse on duty. He did not even remember her face anymore, only a gentle voice and a cool hand placed against his forehead. She had not pushed him out. She had quietly cared for him all night, paid for his medicine out of her own pocket, argued with her supervisors to keep him there, and sat beside him until the fever broke. She did not know him. She gained nothing from it. She did it only because she could not bear to watch a child be abandoned to die. The next morning her shift changed, and he never saw her again. He never had the chance to ask her name. But she saved his life, and he had carried that debt all his life without knowing who to repay. Dorian turned to look at Delia, and in those pale gray eyes now shimmered something she had never seen before, the restrained tears of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to cry. He said that on the night at Rose's, when she stood up and paid for his meal with the last money she had, expecting nothing in return, he had seen that nurse in her. After 25 years, he had met again the very kind of goodness that had saved his life when he was a child who meant nothing to the world. And then he discovered that she was a nurse, that she did the same work as the woman from long ago, caring for the people society had abandoned, and that she was being trampled by a devil. Did she understand Delia? This had never been only about repaying her. This was the lifelong debt he had finally found a way to repay. She was that woman, and helping her was the only way he had to say the thank you he had never been able to say all those years ago. Delia stood motionless, tears running down her cheeks, because now she understood that the thread binding 2 strangers like them together was not $19, but something far deeper and more sacred, a chain of kindness passed from one heart to another, across the years, an unnamed nurse saving a poor boy, the boy growing up and saving a poor nurse, and in that moment she realized that kindness was never truly lost. It only waited, sometimes for decades, to return at the very moment people needed it most. What happened afterward did not unfold through violence, but through something slow, precise, and unstoppable, like water finally cutting through stone, because Dorian understood that the only way for a man like Rourke Devereaux to disappear forever from the lives of these people was not to make him afraid, but to make the very legal system he had always smugly slipped past finally swallow him whole. Yvette's file case, combined with everything Dorian's network had quietly gathered over many weeks, the ledger recording the loan sharking debts, the security camera footage, the testimony of the former accountant and the delivery driver, all of it was arranged into a complete case file, so airtight that no lawyer could deny it. And it was delivered to an honest prosecutor whom Dorian knew was in no one's pocket, through channels that could not be traced back to him. Only a few days later, the police stormed Rourke's den, and this time he had no forged records to pin on anyone else, no desperate victim to use as a shield, only his own sins written clearly in black and white: loan sharking, theft and illegal sale of medication, threats and extortion. The medicine theft ring he had led was completely exposed, the receivers, the middlemen, every link dragged one by one into the light, and an entire network that had drained life from poor patients for years finally collapsed in the sound of handcuffs locking shut. For Delia, the change came like rain after a long drought. The forged papers Rourke had used to threaten her, when compared against the real records and Yvette's testimony, not only failed to harm her but became evidence against him. And the hospital board, after everything broke open, not only cleared her completely, but was forced to look again at the night shift nurse they had long taken for granted. She did not merely keep her job. She was spoken of as one of the people who had helped bring the truth into the light, though she had never sought that recognition. But perhaps what moved Delia most was what happened to Yvette. The head nurse woman Delia had once hated and suspected, voluntarily disclosed her entire role in the network, hiding nothing, excusing nothing, accepting that she would have to face the consequences of the things she had done under coercion. And because she cooperated, because the truth came out about how Rourke had controlled her through her own grandson, and because a skilled lawyer unexpectedly appeared to defend her, though she knew very well who had quietly arranged it, Yvette received leniency, a second chance she had thought she no longer deserved. Delia visited her afterward, and they sat together in Yvette's small room, two women who had once stood on opposite sides of a misunderstanding, now joined by understanding. Yvette said she had lived in fear and shame for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to lift her head, her eyes red, though this time the tears were tears of relief. She told Delia that she had given her the chance to begin again, Marsh, that she had believed Yvette was still a human being even when Yvette herself had stopped believing it, that her grandson was safe now, and every morning when she woke up, she could look in the mirror without turning away. She owed Delia that. Delia took her hand and shook her head, telling her she owed her nothing, Yvette, that she had chosen the right thing at the most important moment, no matter how hard it was, and that was something only she could have done. And when Delia left Yvette's home and stepped out into the afternoon sunlight, she carried with her a strange feeling she had not known for a very long time, a deep relief, because the devil who had tormented her life, who had stolen the medicine her mother needed, who had threatened her little brother, had finally been brought down, not by hatred or violence, but by truth, by the courage of ordinary people daring to stand up, and by a chain of quiet kindness that had connected them to one another when they needed it most. A few days after Rourke was arrested and Noah had been brought safely home, chattering to his sister about the pictures he had drawn at their aunt's house and the stray cat he had befriended, Dory invited Delia to a small, quiet cafe, and this time there was no shadow of danger or threat hanging in the air. Only two people sitting across from each other, beneath the morning sunlight pouring through the window. He placed a stack of papers on the table between them, and when Delia looked down, she saw that it was the entire file on her debt, the debt that had weighed on her shoulders for 3 long years, the debt that had begun with her mother's hospital bills, and across all those pages now was stamped one single mark, paid in full. Dorian said softly that he had bought her debt from the people who had taken over Devereaux's business, and now he was wiping it clean. She did not owe anyone a single cent anymore, Delia. She was free. Delia looked at the papers, her trembling fingers touching the stamp, and she felt as though an invisible stone that had been pressing on her chest for years had finally been lifted away, leaving her so light she almost did not dare believe it. Then he went on, his voice gentler now. Noah's medicine would be secured for the long term, not only for a few months, but until the boy was grown and able to care for himself. Dorian had arranged for him to always be treated by the best doctors, with the best medication. The boy would never have to struggle through another night for breath simply because there was not enough money. Tears spilled down Delia's cheeks, and she had to cover her mouth with her hand to keep from breaking down in the middle of the cafe, because this was the thing she had prayed for, longed for, and traded her health and sleep to obtain for so many years, and now it was being given to her so gently, as though it were nothing extraordinary. But Dorian was not finished. He told her he wanted her to be the first to know this, that he had decided to establish a fund, under another person's name so no one could trace it back to him, dedicated solely to the pediatric ward of Marlowe County Hospital, a fund large enough to make sure that from now on, no child who came to that hospital would ever be sent away without medicine just because their family was poor. Not one more child. Never again. Delia looked up at him quickly, and in that moment she understood the deeper meaning behind what he had just said, understood that this was how he was trying to atone for what could not truly be atoned for, that this was his answer for all the patients like her mother, who had died because the medicine meant for them had been stolen. A way to make sure her mother's tragedy, and the tragedies of so many others, would never be repeated in another family. She said his name. Her voice choked, and at last she asked the question that had still lingered in her heart, even after she had learned the story of the little boy and the nurse from long ago. She asked why it had to be her. There were so many kind people across this city, so many people who deserved help. He could have chosen anyone, Why had he chosen her, a poor nurse he had only happened to meet in a late-night diner? Dorian looked at her for a long while, then gave a faint smile, a rare smile that truly reached his gray eyes, softening all the harsh lines of his face. He said it was because she had not chosen him for who he was. That night in the diner, she did not know whether he was rich or poor, powerful or ordinary, good or bad. She had only seen a human being treated unfairly, and she had stood up. She had given the last thing she had to a complete stranger, not because she expected anything in return, but simply because it was the right thing to do. He had spent his whole life among people who only gave when they had already calculated what they would receive back. But she gave when she had nothing left. That was the purest humanity he had ever witnessed. Delia, and in the world he lived in, it was so rare that when a person came across it, he could not simply let it pass. She asked why it had to be her, but the answer was very simple. Because she was one of the very few people left in this world who proved that kindness needed no reason. And people like that deserved to have the whole world stand on their side. 3 months passed like a new season, gently knocking at the door, and the lives of Delia and her brother changed in a way she had once thought existed, only in dreams she never dared to dream. Noah was much healthier now. The asthma attacks that had once squeezed his small chest had become less frequent, then almost disappeared, thanks to proper treatment and the best medicines, and now the boy could run, could laugh aloud, could take long, deep breaths that had once been a luxury. One afternoon, Noah ran over to show his sister a picture he had just finished drawing. And when Delia looked down at the paper, her throat tightened, because there, among the innocent strokes of a 12-year-old boy, was the figure of a tall man in a black coat standing like a silent protector, and beneath it he had carefully written the words, "The kind man who helped us." Delia had never told Noah everything, only that a good person had helped their family. But somehow, with the sensitivity of a child, he understood that a stranger had stepped into their lives and lit the light again. At the beginning of every month, an envelope with no sender's name appeared in their mailbox, and inside was confirmation that Noah's medicine had been fully taken care of for the following month, with no message, no demand, only a quiet and enduring care as steady as breath, and Delia always kept those envelopes in a drawer, as if preserving proof that kindness in this world was real. She did not see Dorian often, perhaps because that was the way he wanted it, so her life could remain peaceful and clean, untouched by his world. But once, on a morning when Delia had just finished her shift and was crossing the small courtyard in front of the hospital beneath the early sunlight, she caught sight of him, standing quietly across the street, leaning against the familiar dark car, his gray eyes fixed on the building, where so many people were now being cared for with medicines that would never again be allowed to run short. The two of them did not say a word to each other. The road lay between them, but their eyes met, and Dorian gave that familiar single nod, a greeting, a farewell, an understanding that needed no language. Then he got into the car and left quietly, leaving Delia standing in the sunlight with a gentle smile on her lips and tears gathering in her eyes. That afternoon, while straightening the drawer, she found a letter she had never noticed before, likely slipped inside one of the envelopes, written in strong, careful handwriting, only a few lines long. She had repaid him the debt he had spent his whole life believing he would never be able to repay, and now it was his turn to keep that flame from ever going out. She should keep being kind as she had always been, because the world needed her more than she knew. Delia folded the letter, pressed it to her chest, and understood that some people pass through our lives only briefly, yet left behind a light that guided us for the rest of our days. And if there is one thing Delia Marsh's story wishes to leave with all of us, it is that kindness given without expectation of repayment is never truly lost. It only travels a long way around before returning at the very moment we need it most. The value of a person has never been measured by the money in their pocket or the status they hold in society, but by what they are willing to give when they have almost nothing left. A poor nurse and the most powerful man in the city, who seemed to belong to two worlds that could never cross, were in the end joined by the same shared language of humanity, compassion, and even one small act of goodness, a meal paid for with the last bills in someone's hand, can change not only one life but many lives, spreading through the years like ripples across water. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like and share, so we can spread meaningful stories like this to even more people. and so you will not miss the moving videos we bring you every day. How do you feel about Delia and Dorian's story, and what part of this story moved you the most? Please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep inside your heart, because we always deeply value and listen to every line you share with us. Thank you for listening to this story until the very final moment. May you and the people you love always have good health, a joyful life, peace, and calm every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next videos.